Have you ever taken a moment to ask yourself, why do you work? Presumably, many people are going to offer a similar answer. We work because we have to. This is what's required in order to participate and live in a society. However, confusingly, in Western countries such as Australia, where I was raised, we're spun a hypnotizing riddle. Work is virtuous. Work is good. Working hard is meaningful, and we will find meaning in our work. In trying to orientate myself and understand my thoughts on work and the ethics of work, I've turned to one essay again and again. This essay is called In Praise of Idleness, and it was written in 1935 by the British philosopher Bertrand Russell. Russell, who wrote this essay nearly 90 years ago, preempted a lot of the developments in work culture in the West, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. If you're interested in reading the essay in full, there's a link down below in the bio. But before we get any further, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks. Part 1. What is idleness and why is it praiseworthy? Like many philosophy essays, this one doesn't provide us with a clear-cut definition of idleness, which obviously is pretty frustrating. However, there's a passage where Russell pretty clearly explains what he might mean when he's talking about idleness. Here's what he says. Every person possessed of scientific curiosity will be able to indulge it, and every painter will be able to paint without starving, however excellent his pictures may be. Young writers will not be obliged to draw attention to themselves by sensational potboilers, with a view to acquiring the economic independence needed for monumental works, for which, when the time at last comes, they will have lost the taste and capacity. So one very important theme that comes through in this quote is the fanatical and obsessive instrumentalist attitude that we have in the West. Now, what on earth does that mean? And good question. So the key word is instrumentalist. And I guess to describe this, I might give a personal anecdote. So I host a podcast, and often when I am doing something that isn't related to the podcast, I have, for example, if I'm watching a movie or something, I have this experience where I feel as though this would all be very good material for me to be using in my podcast. And this is what the instrumentalist attitude is. Everything is instrumental. Everything has an instrumental value. And this is the thing that Russell wants us to challenge. He doesn't want us to think about the world in an instrumental way. Everything having its purpose defined by its relationship to work that we could do. As opposed to this instrumentalist attitude, Russell is wanting us to appreciate the intrinsic value of things. So what would this look like? What does it mean to actually appreciate the intrinsic value of things? Well, he captures it in his quote. He says, every painter will be able to paint without starving, however excellent his paintings may be. And this is the point. Today, we no longer have a culture where we are able, or where we feel as though it is worth doing things that don't have instrumental value. We aren't taught to do things because of the intrinsic value that things have. We're instead taught to treat things as a means for some other purpose. So take the example of a painter who isn't very good at painting, who hasn't had much commercial success, but they decide to make this their full-time work. In the West, it feels as though we're taught to be extremely critical of people who do things that aren't financially rewarding. It seems as though everything has to have instrumental value, otherwise it's not worth doing. Bertrand Russell is trying to tell us that we ought to do more things because we appreciate their intrinsic value. We ought to try and find the intrinsic value in things. And this, he says, is how we should spend our idle time. Part 2. How do we get idle time? So maybe you're sympathetic to Russell's claim that we ought to have more idle time. We ought to appreciate the intrinsic value of things rather than the instrumental value. But one extremely important question to ask is, where does this idle time actually come from? And now here's where Russell's philosophy starts to get a bit strange, because he starts talking about the 4-hour workday. And here's his claim. As society develops technologically, we will have more idle time, or at least we should. He thinks that it doesn't make sense for us not to have more idle time. Take this example that he gives. Suppose that, at a given moment, a certain number of people are engaged in the manufacture of pins. they make as many pins as the world needs, working, say, 8 hours a day. Someone makes an invention by which the same number of men can make twice as many pins. Pins are already so cheap that hardly any more will be bought at a lower price. In a sensible world, everybody concerned in the manufacturing of pins would take to working 4 hours instead of 8, and everything else would go on as before. So there's this pin factory, and in this pin factory, employees make all the pins that are used in the world every day by working 8 hours. Let's say they make 10 pins. Then, as technology increases, a machine comes in that can make 5 pins in 8 hours. So, essentially, the workers would only need to work 4 hours to make the remaining 5 pins to meet the needs of the world's pin use. But Russell says this never happens. This isn't in our culture. Our culture isn't just to meet the needs of the world. Our culture is to make excesses of things. Next time you're at a supermarket, department store, or shopping center, take a moment to reflect on the vast quantities of things that you're able to buy. It seems like there is far too much being produced than is actually needed at any given moment. In industries where technology and automation are responsible for much of the production of goods and products, we must ask ourselves, what happened to the employees who once produced these things? Are they now working less hours, reaping the rewards of idle time, with the same income which they had while they were working full-time? Unlikely. In these circumstances, when we're made redundant, when technology takes over, when automation prevails, we're expected to retrain, upskill, return to study, and ultimately resume working long hours. Are you concerned about the amount of work that you do, or the years of study that lie before you, or both? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question, and please leave some comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.